Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is The Blond Knight of Germany, Chapter 14, Soviet Prisoner. Treat them with humanity and let them have no reason to complain. Provide everything necessary for them. General George Washington's instructions to Colonel Webb concerning prisoners taken in the Battle of Trenton. After their introduction to the Russian soldier in his role of conqueror, Erich Hartmann and the rest of First Gruppe's officers were taken with the womenfolk to a transit camp at Neubistritz. Little more than a barbed wire stockade, the camp's purpose was to let Soviet bureaucracy take a firmer grip on its captives. Commissars and quill drivers began the formal cataloguing of the Blond Knight and his men. Names, ranks, serial numbers and basic military data were perfunctorily recorded, but the Russians were interested in something more realistic than the status of their captives in a Luftwaffe that no longer existed. Physical examinations were given to the Germans. The Russians were not concerned with the health of Erich and his men from any humanitarian motives, but as an evaluation of their capacity as laborers. Erich's physical capacity to work was beyond question. He was a lean, tough and strong young man of 23, physically resilient and highly intelligent. Bureaucratic formalities at Neubistritz took 3 weeks to complete, after which the Germans spent several days awaiting their fate. Erich found himself musing over the evident Russian intention to make them into forced laborers. The ranting polemic of the communists about exploitation of one man by another kept running through his mind. Marx and Lenin asserted that this vicious situation lay at the root of all evil in the capitalist world. Now, in their time of triumph, these idolaters of Marx and Lenin had no other thought but to enslave their late enemies. A capitalist from the depths of the Industrial Revolution would have saluted their instinct for cheap labor. A move from Neubistritz was imminent. Erich tried to squelch some of the rumors that were sweeping the camp, but to no avail. Men in suspense will speculate, imagine, and even try to manufacture a destiny for themselves. Rumor-mongering halted when Russian guards rudely moved them out of the pen and started marching them southeast along a dusty road. Erich was assigned to load the effects of the old people in a baggage cart and directed to ride the cart under the personal surveillance of an armed Red Army Master Sergeant. In a short time, Erich established contact with the Russian. His name was Sasha. Non-committal at first, he soon warmed to Erich. "Where are we going?" said Erich. "Budweis." Erich knew the town. Budweis was at least 60 miles distant. Since the Russians obviously intended that the column make the journey on foot, he was grateful to be sitting up with Sasha behind the 2 horses that pulled the baggage cart. For 5 dusty days, the dispirited prisoners trudged along, and the rumors grew more and more imaginative. The word Siberia began whispering its way through the column, but at Budweis a Russian commissar put an end to the rumors. He spoke soothingly to Erich, Graf and a group of their officers. "We are not taking you to Russia. This is propaganda, pure propaganda. We are taking you down to Vienna by train, and from there you will go home." The Russian smiled blandly. Erich noticed that the commissar's face straightened immediately when he thought the Germans had turned away. Erich was skeptical, but he could do nothing but bid the kindly Sasha goodbye and board a rackety train the following day. Spirits brightened as the train kept rattling southward, but this soon changed. The train screeched to a halt in a country siding. Russian guards and officers went running up and down outside, shouting and gesticulating. Shunted back and forth with much slamming of couplings and jarring of the filthy coaches, the train was obviously being diverted. When they went lurching away from the siding, Erich could see that they were no longer heading for Vienna. A Russian officer gave them the story in broken German. Big trouble in Vienna, riots, fighting, looting, a dispute over occupation of the city. The train was being sent instead to Budapest. Erich's hopes of an early return home began fading. Budapest was farther east than Vienna and closer to Russia. These were bad tidings. Hours after passing Budapest, there was another jarring halt and more shouting and running. They were at the town of Szeged in the Carpathians. Erich caught the words plague and quarantine as they were shouted back and forth between Romanian officials and Russian guards. The train was dragged into a siding and the Germans climbed out stiffly. They were herded into another barbed wire pen. Erich overheard enough conversation to know that they would not now be going to Budapest and that their probable destination lay beyond, in Russia. De Maramour's pen was run by the Romanian communists. Guards clad in exotic red trousers and armed with long, heavy sticks beat the prisoners unmercifully at the slightest provocation. Erich had to constantly fight down his rage, but the second night the bullies went too far. 2 red-trousered sadists caught a young pilot in the latrine during the night and beat the defenseless man bloody and unconscious. He crawled back into the barracks an hour later on all fours, a whimpering wreck. Erich's hatred for bullies had lived in him since boyhood. Black rage welled up in him at the sight of the beaten young pilot. A tough old major from the German paratroops was similarly incensed by the cowardly attack. 2 other pilots from Erich's group joined them. At intervals, they sauntered out of the barracks towards the latrine. In the gloom of the latrine, the 2 sadists soon loomed with their clubs, eager to fall on another defenseless German and thrash him. Erich sprang out of the shadows as one of the bullies raised his club to strike one of the decoys. Smashing his fists into the guard's face and then driving blows into his belly with all his force, Erich felt the man crumple. He saw the paratroop major's elbows pumping wildly in the gloom and heard the breath go hissing out of the second bully under this assault. In seconds, both would-be disciplinarians lay unconscious on the ground. Erich nodded to the paratroop major. They picked up the guards and dumped them bodily into the latrine, red trousers and all. The sound of the 2 bullies wallowing in the muck was music to their ears as they padded back to the barracks. 2 of the red-trousered guards were missing the following day. The others appeared without sticks. They nodded and smiled as they quietly patrolled the pen. A week later, the Germans were ordered to reboard the train. Machine guns bristled now from the rickety coaches, and searchlights had been mounted on top of several cars. The filthy coaches into which Erich and his men had been jammed on the ride to Budapest were now bulging with heavily armed Russian guards. 60 Germans, including Erich, were relegated to second-class status. They were stuffed into a small freight car in almost intolerable discomfort. The jam-packed baggage car was as hot as a furnace. The air quickly became giddyingly stale. Erich set up a basic routine for lessening the worst aspects of their sardine can existence. 1/3 of the men would lie down at a time in the wagon floor. There was no room for 60 of them to lie or even sit at one time. Lying down for 2 hours and then standing for 4, they began the ordeal of Russian confinement. Hermann Graf and Erich were 2 of Germany's most famous heroes and winners of the diamonds, but the leveling effects of their confinement were irresistible. They lay down and stood up in turn with sergeants and second lieutenants. Other senior officers in the car were Colonel Hein Heurer and Major Arthur Hiele. Rank and decorations were soon forgotten in the common desire to share the floor for each long-awaited 2-hour period. For 2 weeks, they jolted eastward. Navigation skill was unnecessary to find out where they were going. They rumbled through Kiev, Moscow, and Vologda. They were deep in Russia and going even deeper. The train passed through Kirov one morning and went rattling on into a swampy area. Through cracks in the baggage wagon, Erich could see dense marshes and bogs. On every side, the mire went stretching away to the horizon. Lurching through the vast swamp, the train was traveling on the only solid piece of earth in sight, the ground and ballast under the rails. When the train began slowing down, Erich had a hunch they had arrived in the center of a vast peat marsh he had heard about in his school geography books. He was right. Hollow-eyed and gaunt from their grueling ride, the Germans spilled out gratefully into the fresh air, but when they finished stretching, they could see no cause for joy. They were at the end of nowhere. A few Russian soldiers, not more than a platoon, moved around a small base camp. Erich saw in an instant why the Russians needed only a handful of guards. The swamp stretched as far as the eye could see on all sides. Anyone who wanted to escape was welcome to try. The Russians told them to build shelters for themselves. Erich and his men hacked crude dugouts from the ground and roofed them over with wood and branches. This was their only accommodation. Rounded up after dawn each morning with about 1,000 infantrymen already confined in the camp, they were marched out to the swamp fringe to dig peat. Lumps of peat, used by the Russians as fuel, were stacked in enormous piles. Each morning, the Germans loaded the previous day's production aboard the one train that came into the swamp camp daily. Everything was done by hand. After a month of this backbreaking and futile labor, Erich could feel himself cracking. Constant hard labor, lack of food, and the feeling of being lost to the world slowly corroded his will. Chills of self-doubt began flowing in him for the first time, made all the more desperate by the status he held among his comrades. He was their leader by free will consent. 1,500 Germans looked to him to lead them. In the military there was rank, structure and discipline behind leadership. Holding a group of men together in a desolate wilderness like the swamp, where they were all being literally worked to death, was a task to which Erich hardly felt equal. How could he sustain his men when he could feel his own ability to stand the grind ebbing away? In this crisis, his status as a Luftwaffe major became the means of his deliverance. 5 weeks after arrival in the swamp penal colony, all staff officers in the area, rank of major and above, were ordered to a special officers' camp at Grzazowetz. Erich had reached the borderline of endurance when this order was carried out. More than 2 decades later, he is visibly affected when he recalls the dismal slave camp at Kirov and what happened after his departure. He says, "The following year, Captain Werner Engelmann joined us at Grzazowetz. He had been in the swamp camp at Kirov and remained there after I left. His story was shattering. Of the 1,500 Germans who were sent there with me and in other batches, only about 200 survived the first winter. The Russians did not feed them and forced them to work and work until they literally starved to death." By comparison with Kirov, the officers' camp at Grzazowetz was a high-style establishment. Major Hans Asi Hahn, one of the top German pilots of the Battle of Britain with JG-2 Richthofen, was in Grzazowetz at the time of Erich Hartmann's transfer there. Hahn had been in Russian hands since 21st February 1943, when he was shot down on the Eastern Front after running up 40 kills against the Red Air Force to add to his 68 victories against the British in the West. In his book, I Tell the Truth, Hahn describes the environment at Grzazowetz as like a home for convalescents, by comparison with some of the dank and isolated prisons in which he had been confined since his wartime capture. Hahn presents the following sketch of Grzazowetz in I Tell the Truth. He says, "The camp accommodations largely consisted of barracks. The camp administration, the hospital, and so-called convalescent home were accommodated in old wooden houses. The camp was divided into 2 parts by a little stream. The cafe, where you could get a cup of real coffee for a ruble, was at the bridge. The manager of the cafe was a rather dangerous fellow who would use his coffee to induce war prisoners to talk. When the stream was iced over in the winter, ice shooting by the elite of the camp would take place, and in the summer, members of the camp could bathe where they felt like it. The soccer field was in a meadow outside the barbed wire. In the camp, there was a second meadow at our disposal for athletics and gymnastics. In the spring, merely for propaganda purposes, a bowling alley was opened. When the weather was nice, promenade concerts were held in the so-called birch woods, and on Sunday mornings, the dance band played in the cafe. One could hardly have wanted anything better if it hadn't been for the fact that everything was merely a front." When Erich arrived in this environment of relative luxury, fresh from the Kirov swamp camp, it did not take him long to recover his morale. After a brief hospitalization to ensure that he had not brought typhus back with him from the swamp, he soon got his spirits up and his bounce back. A job in the kitchen, a relatively easy assignment with access to all the food he needed, further enhanced his new outlook on life. These were the circumstances under which he was introduced to the strange and divided world of German POWs in Russia. Incarcerated Germans, whether officers or not, were far from being a monolithic block of determined resistors. In this respect, the outwardly luxurious Grzazowetz was a veritable jungle. The background to the divided loyalties of many imprisoned Germans is to be found in the political makeup of pre-Hitler Germany, when there were millions of convinced communists and the Communist Party was a major factor in elections. Hitler's seizure of power grew out of the communist threat to which he and his Nazis were mortally opposed. After Hitler became Chancellor, the communists were deprived of all possibility of obtaining power and the movement was suppressed. There is nevertheless no evidence that millions of communists who lived in pre-Hitler Germany, whether members of the Communist Party or not, relinquished their convictions. Hence, it should not be surprising that following the catharsis of Germany's defeat and under the stimulus of Soviet confinement, many Germans became allied with the Soviet cause. Organizations like the so-called National Committee and the German Officers' League were formed in the Russian prison camps. Politicians like Ulbricht and Pieck were members of such groups before the Russians released them to run the new East German government. Field Marshal von Paulus, who surrendered at Stalingrad, was another notable anti-fascist, and probably the most notorious was General von Seydlitz, with whom Erich was eventually confined in Novocherkassk jail many years after the Blond Knight had his first experiences with the bewildering political world of German prisoners of war. Establishing the differences between anti-fascists and pro-communists, between German nationalists and masquerading pro-Soviet stool pigeons would have been a challenge to a learned political scientist. In late 1945, the 23-year-old and politically naive Erich Hartmann had to find his way among these many factions, all of them representing themselves as devoted to his welfare. Those who seemed to do best in a material sense collected in the Antifa, that is, anti-fascist movement, and the Antifa became the focus of the pro-Soviet forces. Hermann Graf was drawn to this faction and tried to swing Erich to the same line of thought. Erich was disturbed to find informers and stool pigeons among his countrymen on all sides. Fellow Germans repeatedly asked him to embrace the communist philosophy and confess his crimes against the Soviet people. Even his assignment to the kitchen, although he did not know it at the time, was the opening gambit in an NKVD effort to bring him into the service of the Soviets. A heavy emotional blow came in Gryazovets when Hermann Graf succumbed to an NKVD campaign aimed at his compromise. Graf was a man Erich admired and his last commanding officer in the Luftwaffe. As outlined in an earlier chapter, Graf was among the greatest popular heroes of the war in Germany, as well as a redoubtable fighting pilot with 212 victories to his credit. As one of the 9 fighter aces to win the diamonds, Hermann Graf was a valuable prize to the NKVD because of his decorations and fame. Allegations about Graf's conduct in Russia, made in Asi Hahn's book I Tell the Truth, have made Hermann Graf something of a pariah among surviving German fighter pilots, although the one-time hero is still alive and resides in Düsseldorf. During the war, he proved himself a capable leader and a brave man, and he was widely admired as a fighter by those he led, including Erich Hartmann. Graf kept on flying combat after he won the diamonds, when he could have stepped down. Since Erich Hartmann served under Graf in JG-52, surrendered with him, passed into Russian confinement with him, and generally knew him well, his account of Graf's actions in Gryazovets are of significance. He says, "At the end of the war, Hermann Graf was very famous. Propaganda and publicity concerning him was spread all over Germany. He led the famous football team, the Red Fighters. He was always, in my opinion, a nice fellow and a hell of a fighter. But underneath it all, he was a man of essentially simple character. He had not been given the advantages of a long and careful education, as were many of his later critics. After the surrender, he was stripped of his fame and reduced to plodding along from one day to the next at menial jobs. His dissatisfaction with the change was evidently something he could not control. One day, he came to me and said, 'I've changed my mind about staying here,' and he asked me if I would join him in switching to the Soviet side. I told him I had no such intention. He said, 'All the old regulations are gone and each of us must choose either the Anglo-American way or the Russian way. There is no Germany anymore. I have decided that I want to be on the Russian side.' Soon afterward, he wrote to the Russian administration, offering his services to the Soviet Union and offering to take one rank lower in the Red Air Force than he had held in the Luftwaffe. He was soon afterward flown out of Gryazovets to a camp near Moscow. He wrote a laudatory article in the POW newspaper about the Red Air Force and told the Russians about his experiences against the Anglo-American Air Forces during the war. He came back to Germany in 1950. Graf thus was repatriated 5 years before Erich Hartmann, but that the one-time Commodore of JG-52 contributed anything of real value to the Russian cause is doubtful. History will say it is unlikely that Hermann Graf could tell the Russians anything they did not already know or have access to through espionage. Graf's limited abilities, despite his unquestioned combat courage, were of doubtful utility to the Soviets. Nevertheless, the NKVD compromised him, and he has dwelled in the shadows ever since in the German fighter pilot fraternity. At the time Graf confessed his change of heart to Erich, Soviet prisoners had endured little compared with what lay ahead. The Psy-war effort of the NKVD had hardly begun. Graf was a lieutenant colonel in his 30s and considerably more mature than 23-year-old Erich. The two winners of the diamonds gave each other their word of honor that neither of them would ever surrender his decoration to the Russians. The brilliance would be thrown away. Erich was summoned a few days later to the office of Captain Klingbeil of the NKVD, a renegade German with the inappropriate nickname of Dad. Hermann Graf's diamonds were lying on his desk. Erich was shocked. Klingbeil demanded Erich's diamonds as well. "I threw mine in the river," stammered Erich, struggling to retain his composure. Dad Klingbeil's face darkened. Then he gloatingly held out Graf's decoration. "You should have the good sense of your old Commodore, Colonel Graf. He has turned his diamonds over to us and confessed that all he did in wartime was wrong." Graf had not only been compromised by the NKVD, but also had gone back on his word of honor to Erich. The effect on Erich was shattering. If a fighter like Graf could go under, Erich thought to himself, then who could be trusted? When he subsequently confronted Graf about breaking his word of honor, his former Commodore was so ashamed as to be almost in agony. Erich told him that henceforth they must go their separate ways, and on that basis they parted. The strange, impenetrable, yet intangible barrier that suddenly appeared between them was a new experience for Erich. Graf's defection was a powerful psychological weapon against young officers, and the NKVD made full use of this asset. Erich's natural analytical ability soon led him away from the Antifa movement into which Graf had tried to draw him. The men whose views he shared were those branded by the NKVD and its German stooges as fascists. They were actually decent German officers determined to maintain their self-respect and not become tools of the NKVD psychopaths. Erich allied himself with this bloc of recalcitrant Germans and began his long struggle with the NKVD. These resistant staff officers were placed in separate quarters and classed as agitators by the prison administration, which consisted of redlining Germans under the Stalingrad war judge Schumann. These renegades announced that Hartmann's group of agitators could have no visitors in their segregated quarters, thereby cutting them off from contact with the rest of the camp. Erich went over the head of Schumann to the NKVD commander and demanded that visiting rights be restored. His forceful presentation on behalf of the staff officers resulted in the NKVD overruling their renegade German lackeys. Furthermore, the Politburo's representatives in the Hartmann group, Dr. Bauer, was removed following Erich's representations. These dramatic concessions seemed too good to be true. Erich got the old fighter pilot's apprehensive feeling in the backside. Something was afoot. Summoned soon afterward to the office of the NKVD commander, Erich found Captain Uvarov in a genial mood. A couple of years older than Erich, Uvarov had blonde hair and blue eyes just like the Blond Knight. He could have passed anywhere for a typical German boy in appearance. Seated in a comfortable chair, Uvarov offered Erich a cigarette. "Please sit down, Erich," he said. Erich definitely felt the same feeling in the backside now that he used to get in the air when a Russian fighter got on his tail. "Better watch this fellow," he told himself. He took the proffered cigarette and sat down, nodding his thanks to the Russian officer, but remaining deadpan. Uvarov leaned back in his chair and blew smoke in the air. "Are you satisfied and happy now that Bauer has been removed, Erich?" The Blond Knight nodded. "Then you can see how anxious we are to get along with you, Erich. When you want something done, we do our best to oblige." "That's very kind of you." "Yes, we are kind, even to our biggest enemies, those like you who destroyed hundreds of our aircraft." That is why we assigned you to work in the kitchen, so you can eat as much as you like." "The kitchen job has been pleasant enough," said Erich. "Perhaps then you would care to show some goodwill toward us, reciprocate the cooperation we have shown you." Erich knew Uvarov was on his tail now. He waited for him to open fire. "There are a number of men among the staff officers in your group who are guilty of serious crimes against the Russian people. They have shot civilians, burned villages and destroyed factories. We know that they are secretly fascists and make propaganda. Here is a list of the names." Erich ran his eye down the list. Colonel Wolf, Colonel Ackermann, Colonel van Kamp, Colonel van Tempelhof, Lieutenant Colonel Prager, Majors Hahn, Ewald, Ellerbrook and others. Most were professional soldiers committed since boyhood to honorable conduct in war. Erich looked up from the list at Uvarov. "What do you want me to do about these men?" Uvarov took the bait. "Listen to them. Find out what they did during the war crimes they committed, shooting civilians, looting, burning." The Russian was speaking faster and faster. "Report everything to us about their past, their families, everything. We know we can rely on you to bring them to justice." Erich retained his deadpan. "And what happens to me if I do this work for you?" Uvarov was sure he had a pigeon now. "Why, after you've written down everything for us, you will go back to Germany on the first train. So, when can we expect the first report from you, Erich?" "I cannot ever make such a report." Erich spoke slowly and quietly, in contrast to the Russian's agitated tone. Uvarov shot forward in his chair. "What do you mean you won't make such a report?" His voice was shrill. "I mean, I will not do what you ask. First, these are all honorable officers. They would be as outraged and angry as you over wanton killing of civilians. To try and inform on such men for my own gain, to become a stukacha, is unspeakably dirty. I will not do it, now or ever." Uvarov was obviously fighting down his fury. He thrust a paper across the desk to Erich. The document was written in Russian. "Sign it," he said. "This document is not in my language. What does it? The paper says that you certify you were interrogated without being threatened. It is routine. Please, translate the paper into German and I will be glad to sign it. Otherwise, I will not sign. It could be for my own death for all I know." Uvarov's face was now a savage mask. "Damn you, Hartmann, I am a Soviet officer. You take my word for that. I will not sign unless it is in German." "You damned fascist, you will work for us, or by God, I guarantee that you'll never see Germany again." Uvarov hammered the last sentence home by pounding on the desk with his fist. Erich took a final puff on his cigarette and crushed it out on the ashtray beside the Russian's hand. "You can do what you like about sending me home. I am not able to do anything about that, but I absolutely refuse to be an informer for the NKVD under any circumstance." Uvarov's face was purple with rage and the veins bulged in his neck. "Damned fascist! You damned fascist, Hartmann! Your holiday in the kitchen detail is cancelled. You hear that? No more easy work and a full belly. You'll go to work on the road building detail that'll sweat the insolence out of you." "Is that all?" "No, by God, that's not all. You've insulted me, a Soviet officer. For that, you get 10 days in the bunker. 10 days, you hear? Take him away." Erich stood up and extended his hands as though for handcuffs. "I'm ready." As the guards prodded him out of the door with their rifles, he marveled inwardly at his own ability to control himself. The impulse to spring across the desk and throttle Uvarov had been overpowering. Somehow he had kept cool and in the process his will had conquered Uvarov. There were no medals for victories like this and the rewards were different. We were paid off with time in the bunker. The filthy hole to which he was now consigned was his first encounter with NKVD discipline. 9 feet long, 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, the stone-walled chamber had a dirt floor and no heat of any kind. A shaft about 3 inches in diameter, located in one corner of the bunker and screened with wire mesh, provided the dungeon's total resource of light and ventilation. Beneath the shaft stood an open can that served as a latrine. There was no furniture. Each morning, guards shoved 600 grams of bread, 2 liters of water, and 5 grams of sugar into the hellhole. Sleeping on the ground, half frozen, completely alone, able to tell night from day only by staring up the shaft, Erich knew the bunker was designed to break down the fiercest will. Isolation, stench and chill could melt resolution. Starvation could sap defiance. Without a focus for his thoughts, he might just as well be on the moon. He turned his mind to Usch. He ran through his memories of their childhood love like old and adored movie films. He recalled every detail of their trysts in the theater in Weil, their days in dancing class, and the happy reunions and tender partings of the war days. He played mental games, trying to decide whether their baby was a boy or a girl. The child would be born by now. Perhaps it had fair hair like him, or maybe the child would be another dark-haired, beautiful girl like Usch. He knew he would like that. From the time of his first confinement in the wretched bunker at Gryazovets, Erich had a deep feeling of contact with Usch that gave him indescribable inner comfort. The blackness around him became like a friendly ether, through whose medium he could reach out and find his beloved as though time and space did not exist. Something inside him came alive when he turned his thoughts to Usch in these black dungeons, as though he had plugged in a tiny but powerful dynamo that energized his being. The love and harmony of his home life and his ability to focus on it in confinement eventually proved stronger than the worst that sick men could do to him. The ordeal of the first years in Soviet custody is summarized in a letter written by Erich Hartmann to his wife on October 30th, 1947, and subsequently smuggled out of Russia by a returning prisoner of war. A few such smuggled letters provided Usch Hartmann with the only uncensored contact she had with Erich during the 10.5 years of his imprisonment. Official communications remained limited to 25 words on a postcard, during the times when the NKVD did not capriciously reduce the permitted words to 5 or 10. This 1947 letter tells its own story of an imprisoned man's bitterness and frustration. It reads: Camp 7150, October 30, 1947. My darlingest Usch Mutti. Tomorrow another transport leaves here. Maybe this letter will reach you. Now, shortly, my story. Taken prisoner by the Americans on 8th May 1945 and delivered to the Russians on 14 May. On 25 May 1945, we started out from Budweis via Vienna, Budapest, the Carpathians, Ukraine, Kiev, Moscow to Kirov. In a camp in a swamp, we met 1,000 infantrymen and approximately 100 officers, all in pretty bad shape, poor food and miserable treatment. In Kirov, I became the leader of the officers' group. Graf was with me and was in charge of all. The infantrymen were worked so hard that they died like flies, 2 to 5 of them a day. On August 17, we raised the devil with the Russian administration and all officers were loaded and brought to this camp, now called Camp 7150, 60 kilometers south of Vologda. I am still in this officers' camp. Accommodations are in large barracks, one room for each 400 men, with narrow plank beds, the whole arrangement revolting. I am sure that cattle in Germany are better housed than we are. But of course, one gets used to it, even sanitary facilities that are like 1,000 years ago. Medical attention is passable. Food consists of 600 grams of bread, 30 grams of butter, about 1 ounce, 40 grams of sugar with 2 thin soups each day, total about a pint, and about 3/4 of a pint of porridge. One is eternally hungry. There is no bathtub, only small wooden buckets being provided for this. People living under such conditions appear as you might expect, and dystrophy is common. I personally seem to assimilate food well, which helps me see this life through. The camp is administered by the NKVD, the Russian secret police, aided by renegade Germans. Among these is a German military judge who is mightily afraid of the Russians, but does his share organization-wise. The others are mostly political swine and traitors and similar types in charge of the camps. They call themselves the Antifa. Looked at closer, they are former SS medics, Hitler Youth leaders, SA commanders and similar trash. I don't know what the Russians mean to do with them. Yesterday they betrayed us and tomorrow they will change flags again. Such people make imprisonment hell for us. Until about 9 months ago, there was continual strong political pressure brought to bear on us. Every suspect was put to a political test and that, of course, had its reaction upon us all. Political attitudes governed the kind of clothing, type of work, and general treatment given to the individual prisoner. From their appearance, one could guess where the sympathies of the various prisoners lay. I was shocked to see, for once, the German officer corps with its pants down. There was no profession nor rank where one could say they had all resisted successfully. Colonels steal, turn traitor, denounce their comrades and play informers for the NKVD. I can tell you that I have learned to look at people through strong glasses to see if there is anything behind the makeup, the outer facade. We get a change of laundry every 1 or 2 months, once every 3 months in summer. Now winter covers this dirty country with its white coat, and bedbugs and fleas are our constant companions in their hundreds of thousands. I do not exaggerate their numbers, so much for exterior circumstances. Now to myself. As a German Tipu, which means hero, I am personally rather well treated by the Russians, probably because of the consistency of my behavior. Once I was brought before an NKVD board, a sort of trial, but I was released because I immediately asked to be shot. They did not accept. The other methods they use I will not describe. You've probably already heard about them. I did not know anybody when I came to this camp, only Graf was with me. He soon went over to the Antifa and then wanted to influence me constantly. In this area, I was entirely ignorant and let them lead me astray during the first months up to a point, but I soon saw through their game and went my own way as a so-called fascist. Thank God my own countrymen now keep away from me. Informers turned me into the NKVD and I suddenly faced this trial in the middle of the night. I was accused of being an arch-fascist, a saboteur and the instigator of a resistance movement. Here were the Middle Ages with their Inquisition methods, but I did not fail to make the proper answers. I was able to refute all accusations until the Russians themselves recognized what my countrymen had tried to do to me, and the NKVD then punished the informers. After this, I was left in relative peace. Graf was sent to Moscow and follows a downward path there. The first year, we were forced to work, even the staff officers. Work here is the worst type of slavery imaginable, worse, I believe, than in Roman times. Can you conceive of 6 or 8 civilized, educated human beings strapped into a harness and pulling a wagon like horses before a plow? Roadwork is all done with spades, heavy wood cutting with hand axes, and all work is to meet specific quotas or food was immediately reduced. At the end of 1945, a sudden command was issued that staff officers thereafter were only permitted to volunteer for work. Since I felt I was not born to work for the Russians, I ceased work immediately. Threats, exhortations and flattering inducements were all turned down. I do not count on being freed until the end of 1948, and also at that time only if pressure is exerted by the West and if there is no new war. A new war would make the outlook black for us. We are counting on getting home with the assistance of the West. Mail is the only thing we have to look forward to in here. The NKVD shows what it is in that respect, 25 words per month. An increase from 10 words per month is true progress in their eyes, and everything else here reflects the effects of this mentality. A thin layer living well, the rest poor and in rags. Their idea of the freest and happiest country. One could write a book on the effects of their born stupidity mingled with their inferiority complexes. So, here you have a picture of how I am. I can only hope that the last of it passes quickly and that we can see each other again and lie in each other's arms. Until then, one says in soldier talk, stand it, fight through it, and courage. Without combat, there is no conquest and no bonus without price, and nothing is given to us for free. We'll meet again, embrace again, and together we'll soar. In my thoughts, I have my arms about you. Your Erich. 8 more years of persuasion and pressure would pass before the yoke was lifted from the stout shoulders of Erich Hartmann. Interesting insight into the life of a POW inside the Gulag. I found the different factions that formed inside the camps quite intriguing, even though we've heard about them in other books as well. We also meet the somewhat famous character of Hermann Graf, who gets imprisoned alongside Erich. Hermann Graf was a very successful fighter pilot as well, with 212 victories to his name. As a youth, he suffered from a jaw injury whilst playing soccer, which is why his face looks a bit askew, in case you were wondering. Now, accounts of his motivation to collaborate with the Soviets differ quite a bit. In fact, the extent of his support for the Red Army at all is not even clear. The common view today is that he acted out of fear, but all accounts of his contemporaries, men like Erich Hartmann, Hans Hahn and Siegfried Knappe, match pretty closely and do not paint him in a very good light. Graf was almost universally shunned after the war by his former peers, and only through some chance connections did he even get a job in post-war Germany. Either way, even Erich himself at some point states that he could empathize with any man who broke under pressure, and he himself admits to struggling quite a bit at some point. Which is understandable after surviving the swamp camp and then even some days in not just solitary confinement but Soviet solitary confinement. But if you think the Soviets are done with our men, you're wrong. The pressure is only going to go up, and we will find out all about it in the next episode. Cheers.